The Halloween of 2005 will always have a special place in my memory, but in this case, special doesn't altogether mean good. Me and my circle of high school friends were all high school sophomores, which meant that there was a lot of transitioning going on in our lives, and the way we celebrated Halloween was changing too. We'd spend our childhoods trick-or-treating, and a lot of the time that was in the company of a chaperone. Then from like 12 to 14, we'd been allowed to go trick-or-treating on our own. Now that we were like 15 going on 16, we figured that we were too old to go begging for candy, and unlike the year before, there was no Halloween parties, least none we'd been invited to anyway. This meant that we were stuck for something to do on what had become one of our favorite nights of the year, and the way we saw it, we needed to fix that, and fast. I know we could have just met up at one of our parents' places for pizza and horror movies, but trick-or-treating had conditioned us with a need to be outside on Halloween, on such a special, spooky night of the year. We needed to be out there in the dark, soaking up that feeling of excitement in the air. The night before Halloween was a Sunday that year, and I remember that very well, because I spent almost all day glued to MSN Messenger, checking to see if anyone had found anything fun for us to do. Then out of nowhere, our friend Brian came in with a clutch telling us that we could hang out with his older cousin, Cody, and his friends over at some abandoned school down by the river. Cody and company were a few years older than us, and they went to a different high school, but we'd hung out with them before, and word was that they were getting a few 12-packs of Bud Light that they didn't mind sharing if we each pitched in a few bucks, and it was music to my ears. Who cared if we weren't invited to some dumb costume party with other sophomores? We were going to have a campfire of tunes and, most importantly, beer. Halloween itself fell on a Monday, and the whole day at school, me and my friends were all super psyched for that night. I get home, eat some food and get some homework done, then right as I'm getting ready to head out, my mom pokes her head into my bedroom and drops a bomb on me. She wanted me to walk my little brother around the neighborhood so he could go trick-or-treating. It meant that I'd be an hour late to our Halloween hangout at the very minimum, and I was not happy about that, but since Mom told me it was that or face being grounded, I just sucked it up and did as I was asked. Maybe an hour and a half later, I get my brother back home, then immediately rush out again, calling my friends to make sure that they're at the hangout spot. I find out that they are, so I practically run the whole way, hoping there's still a few cans of Bud Light with my name on them. When I arrive at the hangout spot, I find it's this abandoned kindergarten that's all fenced off and derelict. I can hear the music playing already, and I can smell the campfire smoke too. But after finding the hole in the fence and rocking up to the hangout, I don't see any beer, except for what's in people's hands, and that's when the guys tell me that they've stashed the beers in some abandoned house behind the back fence, and since I was late, it was my turn to go get everyone a fresh one. They said that their logic was that if the cops showed up, they wouldn't be able to take all the bud, just what people were drinking. If we got busted, we could just bail and circle back and grab the beers and carry on with our night somewhere else. This made perfect sense to me at the time, so I go off towards the fence, where there's yet another hole in the plastic chain link fence. I don't know what the deal was with there being two abandoned properties so close to each other, but the back of the kindergarten basically led right onto the empty home's backyard. It was all overgrown and stuff, so I had to basically wade through all this long grass as I walked towards the back door and these two big panel windows. It was dark, but I'd been given a flashlight and directions on where the beer was stashed. But then, as I'm walking towards the open back door, I hear someone moving on the inside. Seconds later, under the beam of my flashlight, I see a figure emerge in the doorway. They were limping, trying to move as fast as they could, and as soon as they came into view, I recognized them as one of the older kids from Cody's group. Immediately, I'm panicking, because not only did they appear to be hurt in some way, but they had this look of absolute terror on their face when they realized that I was there, and he cried out, "Dude, help me." I'm too freaked out to even ask what's going on at first, but then raise him about to do something. The guy screams as someone behind him starts trying to drag him back into the house. I knew that I had to help, but I also knew that I couldn't do anything just on my own. I had to go get the other guys. I bolted back towards the rear of the yard, pushing myself through both sets of fences, one wood and one plastic chain link until I'm back at the abandoned kindergarten. I run the whole way there, hurtling around the corner of one of the derelict buildings, until I was back in the company of my friends. Then Ren, as I'm about to tell them that we need to go get help, they just crack up laughing. I'm talking wheezing, wailing, screeching, rolling on the floor, kind of laughing. And I realize that I'd just been pranked hard. Everyone's all like, "You should have seen your face doing dumb impressions the way I was running." And to be fair, it was pretty funny, at least for a moment or two. I remember just standing there taking on the chin, nodding along, as if to be like, "Alright, you got me." Then after a while, one of Cody's buddies calmed down enough to ask me what Jay had done. Jay was the one I'd seen in the doorway, the same guy who would beg for help in such a convincing way that it was nothing short of Oscar-worthy. And when I told them all that, they started cracking up again. Apparently they'd been planning to prank me. As soon as they found out that I was going to be late, and as soon as I had placed my little confirmation call on the way out, Jay had gone off to hide in preparation for my arrival. But then I mentioned to the guys how the thing that had made me run was how Jay had gotten grabbed from behind then dragged back into the house. I assumed that they'd sent someone else with him to make the whole thing more convincing. But then when I mentioned the grabbing thing, the laughter started to fade. I remember Cody being all like, "What? Who got grabbed?" But I took this as him playing dumb prank within a prank, if you will. Prankception repeated what I said about Cody being grabbed, and the laughter peters out completely. Cody gives one of his buddies this worried look, then turns back to me, like, "Please tell me, you're kidding me." I told him no swearing that I'd seen someone grab him and that the whole screaming for help thing seemed a little too convincing. And then it hit me, someone attacking Jay had not been part of the prank. What I'd witnessed wasn't some well-executed way of frightening me. It had actually been real. The thought must have hit everyone else right at the same time. But instead of standing there all dumbstruck like me, they just went hurtling off in the direction of the abandoned house. I followed, feeling extremely guilty that I should have done something right there. And then, instead of rushing back to get help, we pushed our way through the fences as fast we could, and I can hear the older kids yelling ahead of us. "Jay! Jay, where are you? Man?" Flashlight beams are zooming everywhere as they piled into the house, checking every room until they found him, and when they did, they found a total mess. Jay had been beaten up so bad that I could hardly recognize him. I had seen his face, maybe only a few minutes before, but in that time, someone had seriously worked him over. There was blood all over his mouth and some of his clothes were ripped, but thing I really remember was how he was awake, but he'd just been lying there because he said that he couldn't move. Every time someone tried to get him up, he'd clutch his chest and cry out. There were a few seconds where we thought that he might have been stabbed or shot or something, and we had to make sure that the only blood was coming from his mouth before we were able to breathe a small sigh of relief. But still, it was only a small one, if he was hurt so bad that he couldn't get up. There was seriously something wrong with him, because we were on some old abandoned property. The firefighters had to cut through chains that were holding the gate shut in order to get Jay on the stretcher, and because the 911 call had mentioned some kind of violent assault, the cops showed up not long after the firefighters did. Thankfully, they weren't interested in the fact that we'd clearly been drinking, and were much more concerned with how Jay had ended up being taken to the hospital. Obviously, I had the most to tell them, but even then, it wasn't much, and we had to wait until Jay was out of the hospital to really figure out what happened. Not that we didn't visit him when he was there, he just wasn't in any mood to talk about it. Whoever had attacked Jay broke his ribs, broke the bone around his eye, and had kicked him so many times in the stomach that he had internal bleeding. As you can imagine, he was in the hospital for quite a while afterward, and in that time, the cops conducted a full investigation, keeping his parents in the loop the whole time so they knew what was happening. Long story short, the empty house across from the derelict kindergarten was being used as a stash house. The other guy said they checked the place out earlier that evening, but hadn't heard anyone moving around upstairs, so they just assumed the place was empty. Little did they know there was some guy upstairs, probably some low-level dealer or something. And course, he's paranoid and losing his mind because he can hear voices coming from downstairs. Then later on, Jay decided to explore the house a little to work out the best place to jump scare me, which is how he ended up walking up the stairs. He said when he got to the top, it was just like, wham. The guy came out of nowhere and basically kicks him back down the stairs. And that's about the same time I appeared in the garden and turned on my flashlight. Jay gets up, limps to the door, sees my flashlight, and the rest you already know. I think what happened that night amounts to the single scariest thing that's ever happened to me as a kid or as a teenager, and to this day, I've never seen anyone look as scared as Jay did when he looked into the beam of my flashlight and cried out to me help. I just wish I did something. The scariest thing that ever happened to me was on Halloween night of 1999. I remember it fell on a Saturday that year because I was a 22-year-old bartender at the time. And whenever Halloween fell on a weekend like that, you just knew you were in for a crazy night. Back then, I was living in Morgantown, West Virginia, so Halloween was always a big event for the college kids, especially the seniors who were old enough to buy booze. Each year, we ran costume competitions, came up with spooky-themed cocktails, played horror movies on the bar's TVs. It was a whole big event. But since Halloween was on a Saturday, the local crowd was going to be mixing with the college crowd and to be one of the biggest Halloween parties the bar ever saw. Naturally, I'm pretty excited about this, so imagine my disappointment when on the day itself, I get a call from my boss, who had a huge favor to ask me. My boss and his partner owned a few different bars and restaurants, and one was down in Fairmont, about 15 miles south of Morgantown. Somehow they'd come up incredibly short-staffed that Saturday, and my boss asked me to drive down there to work the evening shift as their bartender. I could have just said no, and he had just asked someone else to do it, but I knew that him owing me a favor like that would put me in a very good situation when it came to getting off time around Christmas. So I said, yes. I picked up the smartest shirt and slacks combo I could find, given that the place was way more upmarket than the bar I worked at. And then I drove down the Fairmont around 3:30 p.m. to set their bar up. I decided it wouldn't be so bad, because since the place closed to like 11 p.m. and the kitchen staff said everyone was usually on their way out by 11:40, I figured I could just drive back home then walk around to the bar to catch the last few hours of Halloween as a civilian. You know the deal. The shift at the restaurant dragged, but when it was finally over, I hopped back in my car and set off for Morgantown. Now what I should have done was take the 79 back, same way. I've gotten down there before, but once I was in Fairmont, getting onto the 79 would have meant going back on myself, so I figured it'd be quicker to get onto the 19 and head back on a different route. That probably means nothing to people who don't know the area. So let's just say that I took a shortcut. The shortcut proved a big mistake in terms of route choice. The roads were much more winding and considerably less well lit, so any time I made up and not doubling back on myself was lost. Trying to drive as safely as I could, I made it about 80 to 90% back to Morgantown, still driving super carefully, and I'm literally just considering what a dangerous stretch of road I'm on when this other car comes into my headlights. It's off the road, on a patch of grass, not moving, and the passenger door is open. Reaching into the passenger door is a guy who briefly shoots me this look as I drive past him, one that makes me think that he might have needed help. I could have just kept driving, pretending that I didn't see anything, and made it back to Morgantown with time to spare, but part of me knew that I'd feel like a total douche the next day, just leaving someone stranded at the side of the road, when all I could think about was myself. So I slowed down, pulled a U-turn, and drove back to see if the guy needed any help. I'm not gonna lie, it did occur to me that going back might have been a bad idea. It was Halloween, after all, creepiest night of the year, but I figured if I pulled up and the guy looked like an axe murderer, I could just reverse the heck out of there and speed off before they turned my skin into a mask or something. I knew that the person was wearing a white short-sleeved shirt of some kind, so I cut my eye out for it as the car came into my headlights again, but as I pulled up, there were nowhere to be seen. There was someone in the passenger seat, though, so I kept a bit of a distance, opened up my car door, leaned out, then called over to her to see if she was okay. She didn't reply. She kept staring off into the near distance like she couldn't hear me. She looked okay. So I got out of my car to walk over to her, but with each step I took towards the car, I realized more and more that something wasn't right about the woman I was looking at. It was a look in her eye, this glassy, half-awake look. And before I even got over to open the door, I realized that she might not even be conscious. If I'd had parked my car up at another angle, I'd have seen it way before I got close to her. But it took me until I was within touching distance of the car to realize that she was dead. Someone had stabbed her over and over again in the stomach, groin, and thighs. Her t-shirt was a dark color that didn't really show it, but her jeans were just completely drenched. I couldn't quite believe what I was looking at for a second. I mean, there was just so much blood, so much it was dripping off the seat and onto the floor of the car. I don't know if that's where she died, or if someone had posed her in the seat like that, but I remember how frighteningly peaceful she looked, not peaceful like content, peaceful like she'd just chosen to give up at some point. I remember actually being frozen for what felt like a good few seconds. But that could be my mind just pumping with adrenaline, making it feel like it was longer than it was, because it sure did feel like I'd been standing there for too long. When another thought occurred to me, where was the guy that I saw in the white shirt? I can still remember how the question made my flesh creep. And I'm not just saying that as a means of conveying how scared I was. I could actually feel it. It was like I could actually feel the terror running through me. And as I turned back to my car, I prayed that I wouldn't see him standing near it, blocking the route to my escape. I couldn't see it, but you got to remember that I left my car running with the headlights on, and you better believe that I was looking at those dark patches around the lights, thinking he could be right there and I'd never know it. Just looking over my shoulder made me feel incredibly exposed and vulnerable. So I turned back towards the car, only to see something that made me jump out of my skin. It was a tree line, maybe only 10 to 15 feet away from the car, and even with my night vision ruined by the glare of the headlights, I saw something pale shift among the tree trunks. It was the white shirt. It had to be. He was watching me from the darkness. I'm still not 100% certain that that was the case, but I didn't stick around to find out if my worst suspicions were true and the guy had stabbed that poor girl to death. There was no telling what he'd do to me in the name of eliminating a witness. I just ran back to my car and put my escape plan into action, feeling a deep sense of relief when I finally put the pedal to the metal, and needless to say, I didn't end up going out that night. I just drove back to my apartment, called the cops, then spent the next few hours either on the phone with dispatch, waiting for the cops to arrive at my place, then telling them what I'd seen when they finally arrived. I told them what kind of car I thought it was, what the woman looked like, the exact stretch of road that I was on at the time. And when they're done taking notes, they relay everything I'd said to their higher-ups. And from what I can gather, the goal was to get another patrol car to head out of town to find where I was talking about. But since it was a Halloween weekend, the department didn't have anyone to spare. That's when they asked me if I minded taking a ride with them to show them the exact location where the car was. If I had gone off-road, there was a chance that it had left tire tracks, and if they really were dealing with a murderer, the kinds of tires used on the car could end up being the difference between a conviction and an acquittal, and that's why they needed my help. They weren't so much looking for the car, which they figured would be gone already, since I'd stumbled across the scene. They needed the exact spot it had been stopped at so they could potentially take an impression of the tires. Once that was explained to me, I had no problem giving up my time if my testimony was going to be the difference in catching a guy and having a killer on the loose. The choice was an obvious one, so I followed the cops downstairs and climbed into the back seat of their cruiser. They were right about the car not being there, but I did manage to retrace my steps, so to speak, until I was looking at the exact patch of grass and trees of the car had been after that. We had to wait a while until another unit showed up to secure the scene, but eventually I got a ride back to my apartment, even if it was way after all. The bars closed, and let me tell you, I have never needed a drink so much in my entire life. Thankfully, my coworkers and boss were still at the bar I worked at, hanging out after closing time and enjoying a few drinks of their own. I stopped by, they let me in, and boy, did I have a scary Halloween story for them that night. I managed to get a few sympathy beers out of it, and they did a great job of taking the edge off. But going back to my apartment on my own was a different story. I didn't have any nightmares about finding that woman, but it definitely played on my mind for a long time afterwards. The cops only called me once to confirm a few details about the car and the guy had seen, but following that, I didn't hear a thing about it, aside from a few pieces on the local news. I still think about it though all this time later, especially around October and November each year. I wonder if the cops ever caught the guy, if he actually killed the girl or was just trying to get her to the hospital after someone else attacked her. Sometimes, I think I really do see a ghost every Halloween, just not in the sense people might expect. I'm not haunted by some translucent spirit floating around dark corridors. Instead, I'm haunted by that look on the woman's face, the one that looked almost like she'd given up on life, the one that made her look like death didn't scare her anymore.